reading the same text, getting the same education, can really put you in two totally different places, because an education at its base gives you the ability to think critically and think independently. And Brisbane definitely did that. And he came to a totally different conclusion than other folks who had been raised up in that same pro-slavery ideology came to.
Part of the story of South Carolina is that there is a lot of uncertainty, and Brisbane brings that out.
Well, William Henry Brisbane was the son of a low-country planter, and had very few obstacles in his path towards making his way up into the higher echelons of Southern society. And he was well educated. He spent some time at one of the early incarnations of Furman. He was rich, he was wealthy, he had a small army of enslaved people to work for him, he was well married into a good family. He was well positioned in the community, not only as sort of this intellectual, but also a minister. So he seemed to be right on the path of greatness.
We can infer from Brisbane's statements early in his career and their similarity to the kinds of arguments that James C. Furman was making in, for example, his letter to the citizens of the Greenville district, that they had a shared set of values, that they had a shared set of commitments.
So James C. Furman was the first president of Furman. That first graduating class of the Theological Institute, James is actually one of those graduates. He goes to the school named for his father, and he's going to school alongside a guy named William Brisbane. And William Brisbane goes the opposite way. And, James has to say, I disagree with you, and I stick to my slaveholding viewpoints, despite the good opinions, the smart opinions.
Brisbane was the editor of the Southern Baptist and General Intelligencer, and it was one of the more widely circulated pro-slavery newspapers in the South.
And that work of defense for slavery forced him to read very carefully the anti-slavery tracts.
And eventually he got a hold of a book by Theodore Dwight Weld. Weld published American Slavery as It Is. And this was a book that was mainly made up of testimonies from the South, from former slave owners who had converted to abolitionism, firsthand accounts from people who had been formerly enslaved when it was possible. And he read this book and began to craft an argument to point out all of its problems and just couldn't.
Trying to refute that caused Brisbane to agree with its arguments and to see slavery in a much more complete way.
And he realized through his own study and actually looking at the arguments and in a reasoned, sort of well-weighted way, realized that what he had believed was no longer compatible with the preponderance of the evidence. And from a spiritual perspective too, he reread the Bible, he looked at the arguments that he had once used in support of slavery and realized that these were fictional arguments, and there were much better arguments against slavery that he could use, and really couldn't continue to call himself a good man of God if he was not even honest with himself.
The process of emancipation for the people that he holds in captivity is also a drawn-out process.
So what he decided to do was, in his words, to get out of the Negro business. So he sold all but 3 of his enslaved people to his brother-in-law. He thought he was doing the right thing by sort of washing his hands of being an enslaver. So he sold his enslaved people, and then not too long after that moved to Ohio.
Once he's in Ohio, he begins to think more about this. And once he becomes fully converted to abolitionism, he begins to think that he needs to do more about this. And he wants to make sure that those people that he had claimed as captives are in fact emancipated.
He was eventually able to name a price that his brother-in-law couldn't turn down. And with the exception of one person, was able to repurchase his formerly enslaved property. And what he did was he moved these people to Ohio, granted them their freedom, and then began to be able to walk the walk of an abolitionist without being considered a hypocrite.
James C. Furman gets the idea that Furman should be different than its original intentions. Maybe it should move to Greenville. Maybe it should be like other schools in the state that offer what was becoming a liberal arts education, a kind of well-rounded education. And if you think about Furman's own history, to fundraise for Furman, the money is with slaveholders. They need to keep fundraising and build a school and build a structure that could be supported by slaves, both in the construction of the campus and in terms of the daily life of the campus.
So Greenville was the dark corner. We were the state's holdout, right? We were more pro-unionist, or had been historically. And Abraham Lincoln's election starts to change all that.
So as James C. Furman is hearing about this, I think he's just absorbing the vitriol of his moment. And so when he makes this turn in 1860 to start really making forceful, dynamic, pro-secession speeches here in the upstate of South Carolina, it's really shocking.
And James C. Furman stands up at Courthouse Square and gives this very fiery, very impassioned speech supporting secession.
If slaves are liberated, they're not going to work. He talks about how if they are freed, African American men would go after white women and children.
A few days later, the Southern Enterprise newspaper prints a letter to the citizens of Greenville District, authored by he and a handful of other people, and approached white men and put them in this category of being enslaved and subordinate to these Northern abolitionists. And this was not acceptable to the pride of white Southern men.
In 1860, as the Republican Party has been formed and is beginning to put forward candidates, Brisbane was very much a part of that process. He probably would have gone for a much more radical politician than Lincoln as the Republican nominee for president, but when Lincoln was nominated, he was firmly behind him. When the Civil War came, Brisbane was willing to put his words where his mouth was, and he wanted to go and be part of this struggle. He was getting along in years, but his sons had both enlisted, and when he was asked if he wanted to be the chaplain to their regiment, he said, of course. And he went off and he was part of the Civil War in that way as well. And then sort of the best example of being right in the right place at the right time was January the 1st of 1863, when Brisbane was named as the person who was going to publicly read the Emancipation Proclamation for the first time in the South. He got up on the stage and read the words for this crowd for the first time that essentially codified their freedom. Hundreds and thousands actually of freedmen were in the audience to hear their freedom being bestowed upon them in the words of Lincoln, but through the voice of William Henry Brisbane, who going back a couple of decades had enslaved some of them.
So this is a really big story, and for a Furman person to have done this, it represents a sense of transformation and possibility in a world in which it's inconceivable that somebody would do this. It became conceivable.
Slaveholding Examined in the Light of the Holy Bible was probably Brisbane's most important work. He was able to be a part of this chorus of Northerners who were able to use the Bible to show that slavery was not necessarily what these biblical figures had in mind, that American slavery would have been considered sinful. He had perfected the pro-slavery biblical argument. Well, after his abolitionist transformation, he knew every single argument that these pro-slavery ideologues could make and every single verse that they could use as evidence for it, because he had made all of those arguments himself. Because of Brisbane and because of his past, they were able to really prepare themselves in a very, very thorough way for picking apart each and every piece of the anti-abolitionist argument.
There's an important story here about examining one's values and being open to new information in the face of tremendous obstacles and tremendous pressures, both internally and externally, to maintain the status quo.
At most points in his life, he believed that he was doing the right thing. But the more that he thought about what the right thing actually was, that accounts for that transformation.
Brisbane faced tremendous odds, not as much perhaps as those that were in captivity. But he took huge risks to do this, to be open to the idea of this better world. And his journey, I think, is a good story about how one examines the world with courage and with introspection.